Hi there. I want to talk about Paul VanderKlay's video that he made about going back to the Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris debates. And he's looking at these videos after 2 years of thinking about them, and he comes up with some really great stuff. So I wanted to comment on this, and of course I'm naturally going to associate it with Pirsig because my 2-year project has been working on Pirsig's philosophy. So Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson have a common project, and they articulated, or rather Sam Harris articulates it by saying, we're both concerned as to how to live lives worth living, like knowing how to live, or how can we make life worth living. And I'm going to argue that that's the same project that's going on in this corner of the internet. Let's just say the corner of the internet that's sort of beginning inspired by Jordan Peterson and actually inspired by these debates. This is where it really became conceptualized, these two different views of reality. And I would say that how to live is the real question, ultimately, where we are at as a species now, and according to the metaphysics of quality and the intellectual level, you could say. And so how our philosophy is going to inform that is very important. It's going to inform how we see the world. And in this corner of the internet, let's just say the corner of the internet, let me conceptualize it. There's Jordan Peterson here, who influenced rebel wisdom, and within that rebel wisdom corner are John Vervaeke, Paul, of course, and Jonathan Pageau, and people surrounding these three people associated with rebel wisdom, and the people who come on rebel wisdom, and the futurists and all that. So that's this corner. That's how I'm conceptualizing it. And I think what's happening in this corner is a development of a coherent new philosophy or metaphysics or an ecology of philosophies, let's say, that are addressing that big question, how to live and how to live well in terms of the now and the future and the information age and the internet age, and where things are becoming very fragmented, where institutions are breaking down, etc. So let's move on to what Paul has to say about these debates. So Sam Harris conceptualizes what the good life as well-being, and Jordan Peterson conceptualizes it as a meaningful life. So a lot of the things I'm going to say now, of course, are in response to what Paul had to say, and are going to use a lot of the language that Paul used. So I'm going to reiterate some of it. So Sam Harris says we can pull everything out as propositional truths, as objects, and then rationally work on these objects, manipulate actions and behaviors, let's say, and then we can change those actions and behaviors. And this will, as it did in the Enlightenment, foster this well-being that he sees as the ultimate goal of trying to achieve the good life. And of course, well-being is a rational concept. You can measure well-being with instruments like the quality of life test, for example. So behind this is impulse control. And what Paul says is impulse control is behind this entire salvific, what a great word, that's the first time I've ever heard it, narrative irrationality. So you wait and you test where your intuitions, are your intuitions correct, and what is the data that comes from these intuitions. So rationality is objective, let's just say. So the example given is, if you're learning a language, you can learn it rationally. You can learn it with books and grammar and all that stuff, and you never actually need to go to any kind of country that speaks the language. So the word for Harris is theory. And for Peterson's saying life is essentially difficult, and we have to prepare to accept this. And of course, this is where therapy would be useful. And I would say another difference between the two is, even though Peterson uses a lot of CBT, that impulse control thing is a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy approach. Whereas if we're looking at the totality of ourselves as human beings, more in the sense of Peterson's philosophy, that's more the psychodynamic or psychoanalytical approach. And so by embracing this sense that life is essentially difficult, it's essentially suffering, we can weather the responsibility and the sacrifice it takes to make life worth living, because we're going in it knowing it's going to be tough, and knowing that the only way through is to go through that toughness, and then meaning comes out of that. Or meaning, meaning takes you through that, and a more meaningful life comes out of that. And also, my favorite Petersonian concept, I mean, it's really the most important thing I think that Peterson has to offer, is that if you align yourself with truth as it presents itself to your consciousness, this is a way to create a solid foundation that also makes life worth living. So it's very much like manifesting quality. Let's just say the truth that Peterson talks about is very, very parallel to the quality that Pirsig talks about. So for Peterson, knowledge is essentially subjective. Now we're going to talk more about where rationality comes in, and it is a very important tool, and it is a very important tool in Pirsig's work too. So with Peterson, to learn a language, you would go and immerse yourself in the culture and learn by actually speaking it. So the word for him is practice. You got more theory for Harris and practice for Peterson. So let's go back to this philosophy that's developing. If we're talking about a philosophy that's in the midst of developing, it's obviously much more in the Peterson camp. And these dialogues that Peterson and Harris had 2 years ago are pretty much the beginning of this desire to articulate a philosophy for the present and future. It's a game B, if you want to call it that, which is what these futurist guys on Rebel Wisdom call it. And that has been associated, that game B has been associated with the word sense making. So to make sense of combinatorially explosive information that the internet has demonstrated or manifested and demonstrated as objects of information, you need to sense the underlying pattern. There are too many objects. It's combinatorially explosive. You're not going to be able to rationally evaluate everything. You need to see an underlying pattern. So weighing facts is a rational way that can't be the whole picture. We don't have the time. We need to detect a way of sense-making that transcends this rational examining the facts and coming to conclusions. And this would be a metaphysical structure to our thinking that is more pragmatic, meaning in the truth in the moment, which is more based on relevance realization, which is more again, in the Pirsig camp, that quality is reality. You're looking for quality in this dynamic, let's just say, phenomenological reality of being a human being and being a conscious being in the world. So the common thread with this theory that's developing is that it's a meaning-based reality, and that is the metaphysical structure of game B. It's not subjects and objects anymore. This is like Pirsig's quality project. It's a shift from subject-object metaphysics to the metaphysics of quality, where quality is the true reality. So the first concept that Paul talks about in this video is metaphorical truth, which is Brett Weinstein's term. And as Brett Weinstein said, it's a belief that one acts as though, as if it's true, then they will outperform someone who acts as though it's false. It's an evolutionary way of seeing things. So let's look at the example that Paul gives, which is there's a tribe and they manage to survive a tsunami because they adhere to their traditional view where there's spirits in the water, and they work with the spirits in the water, with this belief in the spirits in the water, and that helps them weather the tsunami better than a theory, better than the data that comes out of the science of plate tectonics. So I'm going to read something very parallel from chapter 3 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and this is where Robert says that the law of gravity is a ghost, and he demonstrates that it's a ghost by its non-existence, and a ghost is a ghost is a ghost, okay? So he says to John Sutherland, if that law of gravity existed, I say, I honestly don't know what a thing has to do to be non-existent. It seems to me that the law of gravity is past every test of non-existence there is. You cannot think of a single attribute of non-existence that the law of gravity didn't have, or a single scientific attribute of existence it did have. And yet it is still common sense to believe it existed, as if it's a scientific truth. And yes, it is, but that's not what we're talking about. John says, I guess I'd have to think about it. Robert says, well, I predict that if you think about it long enough, you will find yourself going round and round and round and round until you finally reach only one possible rational, intelligent conclusion. The law of gravity and gravity itself did not exist before Isaac Newton. No other conclusion makes sense. And what that means, I say before he can interrupt, and what that means is that the law of gravity exists nowhere except in people's heads. It's a ghost. We are all of us very arrogant and conceited about running down other people's ghosts, but just as ignorant and barbaric and superstitious about our own. So until Newton, gravity is another inorganic force that can be defined by any descriptor that emerges from our collective understanding of reality. It could be a spirit, whatever it is. It takes Isaac Newton in the Enlightenment to come up and define it as an object, which is the law of gravity. So, like Paul said, all our truths are metaphorical, including the law of gravity. That is a metaphorical truth, like it or not. So why are plate tectonics any better at describing the particular force than the water spirits? Well, in this particular case, they were worse. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is encoded information. And I quickly want to bring up the evolutionary structure of the metaphysics of quality. And so here's a graphic to show you that. You've got the different levels: inorganic, biological, social, and intellectual. And some people say that there will be another one, a spiritual level. But you could also say that the dynamism of quality is the spiritual level, that dynamism. So what Paul and Brett and everyone is addressing here in terms of metaphysical quality is an interaction between, and Jordan Peterson, is an interaction between the biological and social level. Of course, some intellectual. And so Brett says human beings are on two tracks of inherited information. We inherit more information than we are consciously aware of. So much so that this is encoded in action and behaviors and are processed by intuition and feeling. That's what Paul said, encoded in action and behaviors and processed by intuition and feeling. So we're filled with ghosts. We're filled with biological, social, and intellectual ghosts that originate, of course, in the inorganic. And so there's this loop between inherited DNA and cultural information, which is the mythos, which I'm going to talk about in a second. There's a back and forth between our hardware and software. Hardware is biology, software is social, cultural, and experiential, and they influence each other. They restructure each other. Remember in Chapter 2, if you want to see my commentary on Chapter 2 of Lila, which I'm reading in its entirety, there's his card catalog system for writing includes this, that the hardware, and it includes this computer model where the instructions for the computer, for the hardware, are also data that can be manipulated. So the hardware is the biology, software is social, cultural, and experiential. If you ever read Robert Sapolsky's amazing book, Behave, which is the how biology influences our behavior, you're going to notice that all the time. You're going to notice a back and forth between the experiential and the biological. And that's something that really stands out when you read that book. So here's Pirsig's description of how we offload information, and this is from chapter 28 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The mythos over logos argument points to the fact that each child is born as ignorant as a caveman. What keeps the world from reverting to the Neanderthal with each generation is the continuing, ongoing mythos, transformed into logos but still mythos, a huge body of common knowledge that unites our minds as cells are united in the body of man. To feel that one is not so united, that one can accept or discard this mythos as one pleases, is not to understand what the mythos is. We're constantly influencing the mythos, and the mythos is influencing us. The logos part, I'm going to talk about that in a second when I read the next quote with the next passage from that section. So culture is stored in history, and it's stored in us, and most of it, 98%, if you want to look at science, neuroscience, is not conscious, and most of it will never be. in therapy, you can go on and on and on for years. Remember, back in the days of psychoanalysis, people would go into psychoanalysis 4 times a week for 20 years or for their entire life. The threads of these levels are woven in us, and we're never going to be able to pull them apart. It internalizes as the other 3 ways of knowing. We've got, of course, we know what the propositional way of knowing, and the fact that we think everything, the rational way of seeing the world, and that everything is propositional knowledge is so false. It's not even funny. Any advance in brain science has showed us this. And so the other 3 ways of knowing, procedural, participatory, and the other one, which I can't remember, are how we know, not consciously but unconsciously. Consciousness comes into these ways of knowing, but they are largely unconscious. You react and you don't know why, and you can never propositionally know you're unconscious, as we're saying. So much is encoded into us. Because you have so much unconscious material, though, you've got multiple values in competition, and this is true according to the metaphysics of quality, because each level has its values. I want to refer you back to chapter 1 of Lila, and in that you've got this genius guy who succumbs to the biological pleasure of alcohol and subsequently the biological pleasure of Lila, who is someone totally inappropriate for him and who's, looks like she's going to bring nothing but trouble. So you see how these values are in competition. So how do we deal with multiple values? Well, Lila is all about that. And so the next thing that Paul talks about, which is so cool, this is my favorite part, is the great compression scheme. So the great compression schemes take the world and boil it down into stories and systems we can actually work with. And they are sort of a paradigm of our collective and personal experience. And if we understand these stories and systems, then these can help us live well in the world, because the world is too big. You have to compress our collective understanding of it, and this is what religion helps us do. So religion is the JPEG of a too large world, says Paul. I love that. And God is the compression we need in order to live well in the universe. Then Paul mentions something that we talked about in our conversation, which is that I have found that people who are really stuck psychologically and in their lives, and who just can't seem to make progress, it's because they can't get a hold of something transcendent. Because they're going to have a very difficult time overcoming that stuckness, because they're trying to solve it at the same level it was created. Remember, Einstein said you cannot solve a problem at the same level it's created. And very typically how this comes out is it means they can't really see a way out. The only 2 ways they can see out is either the world has to change itself to the way that they think it should be. There's a lot of should with this way of thinking, and a lot of anger that the way isn't the way it should be. This like it rationally should be this way, and why can't it be this way? Which exposes a lot of the problem with the rational way of trying to solve problems. And the other way is they need to force themselves not to care, which of course is absurd. That's again thinking that the rational impulse control that Sam Harris thinks is possible. It's not. Remember, and go back to Jonathan Pageau's critique of Steven Pinker for a really good counter to Sam Harris's rationality is the salvific, I think that's the word, element of human consciousness. Either way doesn't work, because actual transformation occurs by stepping back and getting in touch with that noetic or that spiritual dimension, or the theological dimension is what Paul calls it, or the great compression. You have to get in touch with that long-standing compression of the human experience in order to be able to stand back and see what's going on with these discrete problems that you're having. And this wisdom can inform you how to deal with these problems. And people can't change until they get to that level, the theological level, let's just say. And the theological level is where the compression schemes are so tight and boiled down. The data sets are small enough that we can work on them. and they kind of go all the way out. And we're going to talk about this in a quote, again in that passage of the Mythos Logos aspect of the Mythos Logos section in chapter 28, which is coming right up. Paul also says philosophy is similar, and this is where metaphysics of quality come in the sense that it is metaphysical, meaning that it is a description of reality. And this is the philosophical parallel of the theological in the sense that it's at the bottom. It's what's most compressed. So whether it's God, or whether it's quality, or whether it's John Vervaeke's real world, I think we're all in agreement that true transformation can't occur until you really see the big picture. And the big picture has to be compressed because it's combinatorially explosive. So this compression is my favorite aspect, again, of Paul revisiting these dialogues. Okay, then he talks a little bit about values. And in terms of God and quality, I think they're so intermingled because the universe is oriented towards the good, towards evolution, towards improvement, towards what's better. Remember Panksepp's seeking system. It's always seeking what's good and avoiding what's bad. And every creature that has a consciousness has the seeking system. And that orientation towards the good can be conceptualized in something that God has bestowed upon us and the universe. And it is also the manifestation of God in everything. So any pattern that becomes stable, becomes static, is a pattern that is valuable enough to stick around, that is valuable enough to be useful, that is a compression. So value, or the good, is inherent within it, and it is created by value. The same thing God creates and is in all creation. And one thing Paul says is values have been colonizing facts for a long time. Yes, because value creates facts. The logos is embedded in the mythos. Okay, now we're going to go to the definition of logos from Pirsig. This is a passage again from chapter 28 that comes actually before the one I read before. The term logos, the root of logic, refers to the sum total of our rational understanding of the world. Mythos is the sum total of the early historic and prehistoric myths which preceded the logos. The mythos includes not only the Greek myths, but the Old Testament, the Vedic hymns, and the early legends of all cultures, which have contributed to our present world understanding. The mythos over logos argument states that our rationality is shaped by these legends, that our knowledge today is in relation to these legends as a tree is in relation to the little shrub it once was. The compression. And God is in everything, and this scales out. One can gain great insight into the complex overall structure of the tree by studying the much smaller shape of the shrub. There's no difference in kind or even difference in identity, only difference in size. So a couple more points that Paul said that are just, these are random, but I really, really love them. Well, they're not random in the context of what Paul is talking about, but they're random in terms of what I picked out from Paul's video. So stalking the good versus assuming the good. So one is sort of looking for the good and the other is assuming the good is there. One is the Jordan Peterson way and the other is the Sam Harris way. Sam Harris assumes the good and you just need to find it with rationality. Whereas we have to look for the good. However, I think in the Pirsigian worldview that the good is available to you, but you have to be able to access it. So why? Here's another thing that Paul said. Why is love at the top of the hierarchy? Because Jesus put it there. The agapic love that we're finally able to afford where we are in our consciousness. So when Jesus came around, we no longer needed the punitive God of the Old Testament. Our mythos had offloaded enough to ensure our survival. So we've received a message of the loving God of the New Testament, the agapic love. And our technology and our consciousness had evolved to a point where we could afford to embrace this message. And now that is the highest quality aspect of being a human being. So, a question that Paul brought up, is it natural to know what the good is? And this is a very good question. Pirsig would say, as demonstrated by his experiment with his essays with his students who could always pick out the quality essay. It is the natural way of being. The trouble is we have so many barriers to it, and you have to remove the barriers or traps to detecting that quality and being able to manifest it. Thus, chapter 26 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance that I keep referring to, which suggests to you how to avoid all the gumption traps. And Christianity gives us some excellent static patterns of value, shortcuts, if you will, to the good. Is it better to go deeper and be able to detect quality independently of any religion or independently of any static patterns? Yes, it is best to be able to have direct access to dynamic quality. But these shortcuts, or these overcoming the gumption traps, these are ways to, these are compression methods to help you access what our culture has determined as ways to access the good. Of course, you want to be able to be the sort of person who can do it yourself. And the Christian project is to make you become that kind of person, the person who can detect quality in its most pure form and manifest it in its most pure form. So thank you, Paul. I really enjoyed that video. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.